So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to run you through the second part of our blog work regarding your constructivist interviews. Now, hopefully at this point you've already found some students and conducted your interviews with them. Now, if you haven't been able to do that at this point, please do go back, watch the video for that week, design some really good interview questions, and then conduct the interview, right? Because if you'll remember, the blog, I think from week 15, we asked you to post up the results. And now what we're in the task of doing is analysing those results and seeing if we can use theory as a useful lens to find some useful information for ourselves in order to develop the work that we do with our students and develop our practice in the future. So if you recall the interviews that you've undertaken, we were essentially looking for two very specific things, in taking on this approach, this kind of constructivist hat. We're really seeking to get inside our students' heads in two ways. Firstly, in that we were trying to find out what sense our students made of the content, from a lesson, from an activity that we ran with them, maybe a whole module. Are they understanding the key knowledge? In what way? Are they understanding the skills? Are they able to apply them? Are they connecting the dots potentially between different key concepts? And then secondly, and probably more importantly, how are our students understanding the process of that learning? So moving beyond the content, but looking at their role, their agency as learners. Who do they think is responsible for the learning process? What do they think they should be doing with peers, with independent study, all of that juicy stuff. So as I said, you'll already have done the first stage of your blogging up to this point, and all we asked you to do was an account of some of the key findings and what you've learned about those two questions. And I'm aware that some of you would have woven in some other stuff relating to your action research project as well. That's absolutely fine. You can use it in those kind of two ways, but we're now just going to focus on unpacking it. And what we're going to do is we're going to analyze those particular findings about our students in that constructivist sense, how they're constructing meaning from this particular piece of learning. And I'm actually going to offer you one particular way to link this to the literature. We've just had a really good session on critical thinking, and one effective route that I'm going to give you is using Stephen Brookfield's approach to thinking critically, hunting for key assumptions as a way of analysing what our students are thinking. Secondly, for this report, and this is the final bit we're going to do this week, I would also like you to take some of that analysis, think of some of these explanations, why students are reacting in this way, and think about what implications they have towards the students and their learning process, and what implications they have for how we work with these students in the future. So the way that we facilitate learning, the way we might better understand our students, meet them where they are, help them with particular blocks in their learning process. The final piece of this puzzle we're not getting to yet on the blog, but further down the line we're going to turn our eyes in a kind of meta way back on ourselves and the methods we've used, both in the interview process and also now in the process of analysis, thinking about the models and the tools we've used to understand our students, and we're going to evaluate the tools themselves. So if you think about it, that is essentially the underlying skill of your module 2, linking theory and practice. It's the ability to evaluate the models and the theories based on having used them. So we're going to practice that skill as part of the blog, having undergone this whole process. Lovely. So you can actually take, those two tasks, 2 and 3 that we're doing this week, you could just take them off and run with them now and undergo your analysis, link it into some literature, and think about, how that's meaningful and how that will direct your teaching. I think uh, I think Stephen Brookfield's model of hunting assumptions could be a really interesting lens. So I'm going to do a brief recap of this one, and then I'm going to point you to some key ways that you could use it to inform your analysis of the interviews that you've conducted. So if you recall back, this all stems from Brookfield's book, Teaching for Critical Thinking. It's another great 2011 book. Funnily enough, a lot come out of 2011. And in it, he says that trying to discover what our assumptions are and then trying to judge when and how far these are accurate, that's something that happens every time critical thinking occurs. So he would actually say that you cannot think critically without hunting assumptions. So that is without trying to uncover assumptions and then trying to assess their accuracy and validity, their fit with life. So what we're looking for is we're looking for how our students are assuming things to be true, making intuitive judgments, connecting the dots regarding both the content that they're learning, making assumptions about, the topic, the knowledge, the skills, but also making assumptions about the learning process. And what we can do is we're going to hunt for particular assumptions that might not be so useful for our students, right? If we can find some assumptions that are a bit simplistic or maybe not valid at all or a bit overgeneralized, quite often students have harmful or dangerous assumptions that get in the way of their own learning. So I find this tool tremendously useful in finding where the blocks are for our students. Because if we can nail the assumption that's getting in their way, actually that very neatly informs what we can then do with the student to move them forwards. And of course, Brookfield goes a little bit further and he says that there are different types of assumption that students might have. Brookfield would actually say there are three. I slightly disagree. I think you can chalk it down to four even. So there are assumptions about how things are, an assumption that's to do with your perception and assuming that your perceptions are accurate, knowing that what you've seen is correct and is valid. There are also assumptions about how things should be, how things ought to be. These are the prescriptive assumptions. They have a lot of judgment within them and often, having ideas about who people should be in the learning process, prescriptive assumptions about who ought to be doing most of the work. These tend to be some of the ones that do get in the way for a lot of students, particularly when they're not able to put in the work or manage their time effectively. Thirdly, you've got causal assumptions, A causes B. So assumptions about how things will turn out, having done a particular thing, what the result will be. Quite often as educators, we make a lot of assumptions about what we think the impact of our methods and approaches are going to be. And similarly, students will, students will look and see, okay, well, if I'm going to study in this way, if I'm going to go to these classes, I might assume that I'm going to get this particular thing out of it. And then finally, and I suppose these ones most strongly linked to the first one, are paradigmatic assumptions. So, the very big and almost unseeable and unknowable assumptions that drive and define how we construct reality. So these are the kind of biggest ones to shift. They take an awful lot of work and they're very transformative. So don't feel the need to address any kind of big paradigmatic assumptions of, who people are or, what the world means, because they're very big and very stressful and they'll probably take an awful lot of personal work from our students to do. There's even a discussion as to whether it's our responsibility as teachers to help people with these. That's a very interesting one that we'll get to in term 3, but you can see that 4 different forms of assumption, and this might help you inform, what kind of links, what kind of assumptions and bridges your students are making when constructing their understanding. So Brookfield goes a little bit further, right? Because he's got this idea of coming up or finding assumptions, hunting them, which is the first stage of his process of critical thinking. And that's what we're going to do. We have our data. We've gathered some information back from our students. So we're firstly going to go through the process of hunting for assumptions that have been made. Then we're going to look at those particular assumptions, think about what kind of an assumption they are, check them, see whether they're valid, see whether they hold up to scrutiny. Do they have convincing evidence behind them? Again, or are they a little bit shaky, overly simplistic, maybe a bit generalized out of their normal context? Brookfield would then say that you would look at the situation, look at the assumption from lots of different viewpoints. Now, this one we're sort of doing already, right? Because, we're trying to look at these situations through the eyes of our students. So that very naturally is the process of seeing a different viewpoint. However, we can also build that gap by, say, comparing one student interview to another student interview. Seeing how two people's perspectives of our module differs. You might also draw in some other relevant theory. You might look at, say, deep and surface level learning to compare with the approaches that two of our students are having. And it's at the centre of that you get some very deep and critical and well-informed discussions about what things mean and how people are making sense of reality. And finally, of course, critical thinking is frankly a bit pointless if it's not in the service of taking informed action. And as you know, in this case, the informed action that we want to take is we want to identify ways that we can improve our practice and ways that we can help our students better in their learning. So, I've kind of explained that process already in terms of how we'd unpack the interview. Again, you're more than welcome to go and just get started on it. But to reiterate the point, we're hunting within the data that we've gathered for certain assumptions that have been made, right? And these assumptions are things that make true the particular point of view that are being held by our students and also by us. So looking at your data, what assumptions have your students been making, both of the content and the material, and also the process of their own learning? What do they assume to be true? What do they assume, will happen if they behave or don't behave in a certain way? What assumptions have been made about, what should be happening? Similarly, right, both from our students' perspectives, but from our perspectives as the tutor, as the interviewer, have we made any particular assumptions, about our students or about the situation and the module? Again, about how things are, how things ought to be, should be. Quite often those two are the ones that differ considerably, and also assumptions about, how things will turn out. Maybe you had a particular point of view of what your students would be like and what they'd share with you. Maybe that was a bit different, and you can explore the differences between those two perspectives. Having found your assumptions, how might you test those? Right, you don't have to go back and perform a big piece of research or anything, but is there convincing evidence for these assumptions that holds them to be true or not? Or if you don't have enough data, what might constitute good evidence, and how might you go about finding out? And finally, having looked at these, having shaken it about a bit, having had a conversation between your perspectives, how might this actually inform how we work with our students? Having looked at maybe an assumption they've made about the module, maybe they've got some of the key content wrong. Will that direct you to go back and cover the content again? Will that inform you to get peers to discuss with each other, get a bit of peer learning going on? Or are you going to have a one-to-one sit down with the student and really cover that misunderstanding? Or if there's assumption about the behaviours that students should be taking, potentially there could be an assumption that you're the one doing everything, as the tutor. It's not the student's role to be active in the learning process. Well, what you're going to do to take that assumption down and help your students understand that actually they need to be putting a bit more in. That's quite a delicate assumption to play with. We don't want to shatter these. We just want to, find a meaningful step forward. And again, if you've got anything that's particularly troublesome, particularly difficult, there will likely be plenty of good educational literature out there for things for you to be working on. So as a final reminder, that sounds like an awful lot. You certainly don't need to answer every single one of those questions. That could be a deep, very large part of your research project by itself. But with the data you've got, with the answers from your students, give us an analysis of your findings, looking at their assumptions, testing them out a bit, and then what does that inform about the ways you're going to work with them in the future? Cool. I'll look forward to hearing your responses up on the blog. It should be a fun one, and I will see you next week. Take care.